So in the moment, this was a very powerful scene. It was a powerful moment that felt like it would ripple throughout the rest of the series. But the truth is, the brutal sacrifice of Shireen turned out to mean nothing. Let me explain. So nobody is going to deny that in Game of Thrones Season 5 that the death of Shireen was absolutely horrific. It was a really gut-wrenching moment as you watched the scene play out, and we the audience had to just sit back and listen to Shireen scream, and even Seleyse finally seems to snap out of the possession she's felt for the Lord of Light and clearly regrets the decision to sacrifice her daughter. It's really difficult to take in as an audience. Meanwhile, Stannis stands by, steadfast in the faith he has placed into the power of Melisandre and the perceived power of a blood sacrifice. Now, if you go all the way back to 2015, you might recall that those who were actually critical of the decision to sacrifice Shireen felt that they really screwed up the character arc for Stannis. While on the other hand, some who praised the choice felt that this demonstrated that Stannis was willing to sacrifice anything in pursuit of his own chosenness or prophecy. You can let me know what side of this you felt is most accurate in the comment section. Did sacrificing Shireen break the character development of Stannis, or did it further develop the character? I personally believe that the decision was derived from what many book fans believe would become a plot in one of the still yet to be published books in the series by George R. R. Martin. But just looking at the show in isolation, I do believe that this really damaged the overall character arc of Stannis, but not because it betrayed the character's prior development. I'll explain exactly what I mean by that here before I conclude this video. The sacrifice of Shireen was powerful, and more importantly, I believe it did feel somewhat earned throughout Season 5. I want to take you back to Episode 4 of Season 5. In this scene, Shireen comes to visit her father Stannis, and it's probably the most touching scene that involves Stannis in the entire series. Shireen is insecure and unsure of herself and her value here. She's vulnerable and asks her father a very vulnerable question.
Are you ashamed of me, Father?
Now, when you put that into context, just a couple lines back, Shireen tells her father that her mother Seleyse told her she did not want Shireen to come with them to Castle Black. Stannis tells Shireen that her mother should not have said that, but this plays on Stannis, additionally due to a prior scene between Stannis and Seleyse. You can interpret this as Seleyse expressing that she was not good enough for Stannis and only brought him weakness and deformity, and we'll touch back on this in just a minute. But when we go back to this moment between Stannis and his daughter, Stannis actually comforts Shireen and offers her reassurance. She sought out her father's comfort when she felt unsure of herself, and Stannis delivers a truly heartfelt reply by sharing the story of how Shireen became infected with grayscale, but more importantly is the lengths Stannis went to be sure Shireen would be cured when anyone else may have sent her off to Valyria to live out her days with the Stonemen.
Because you did not belong across the world with the bloody Stonemen. You are the Princess Shireen of House Baratheon, and you are my daughter.
When Stannis calls her the Princess Shireen of House Baratheon, it informs her that she does belong, and just as importantly, it is evidence against the narrative that Stannis is unloving, and until this point, Stannis had lived up to that reputation. It truly offers the character some real nuance. You see, there becomes a battle within Stannis of what he's willing to sacrifice and fulfilling a prophecy. However, ultimately sacrificing Shireen demonstrates that Stannis has chosen to pursue prophecy and Shireen is sacrificed. So right here, this is the first time we see Seleyse actually become human and regret the sacrifice of Shireen, which I like this reaction because it better characterizes her relationship with Shireen and how she felt Shireen represents her lack of worthiness for Stannis, more so than her own embarrassment of Shireen. Now, when we focus on Stannis, the character witnesses his daughter's sacrifice, and for me, this is gut-wrenching because of the additional development that we got for their relationship here in Season 5. Before the actual sacrifice scene, we are given an additional scene where Stannis goes to visit Shireen. She happens to be reading the story of the Dance of the Dragons, and Shireen explains vaguely that the dance is actually not about who is right or wrong between Rhaenyra or Aegon II, but rather having to choose sides is what ultimately creates the greatest tragedy of it all. Stannis then takes this to discuss how a man must fulfill his destiny. Not really knowing what Stannis means, Shireen sadly offers to help, and while this adds a bit of innocence and dread for the audience, she also makes a callback from her scene with Stannis earlier in Season 5, where she says, "I'm the Princess Shireen of House Baratheon." This endearing moment that Shireen experienced with her father gave her a real sense of belonging, and it's called back here in a fairly morbid manner, because unlike the death of Renly, where it is made clear that there is no love among the three Baratheon brothers, Robert, Stannis, or Renly, this scene between Stannis and Shireen, where Stannis expresses his love for his daughter and his acceptance of Shireen as he tells her how he did everything he could to cure her of grayscale, clearly that demonstrates the value of this relationship between father and daughter. It's the one area for Stannis that can be viewed universally as loving and sympathetic. Up until this point, Stannis has been a stoic figure, determined by duty and destiny, where Shireen offers his character real humanity. So as we watch Stannis witness his daughter's death, as an audience, you could view this as the point of no return for his character, where Stannis is no longer someone you can relate to or sympathize with, as he has transformed away from his most redeeming quality. His right to the Iron Throne, fulfilling prophecy, is essentially all that drives his character forward. And with this sacrifice, he has paid a great price to fulfill his destiny. It becomes the question of what it's worth between a child's life and a kingdom. But here's where the problems begin, but certainly not where they end. In the very next episode, after Shireen's sacrifice, appears that the gesture of burning Shireen has been rewarded. The brutal weather has broken, and it appears that the Lord of Light has made good on rewarding the sacrifice. But instead, we find that half of Stannis' army has abandoned him. This alone is devastating for his cause, and makes a siege of Winterfell against the Boltons far more challenging, if not impossible. As Stannis learns this news, you can see Melisandre's expression to communicate that this is not the reward she had promised. She knows that this is a devastating turn of events for Stannis. This alone makes the sacrifice of Shireen to be a sacrifice in vain, and as painful as that may be, we learn that Seleyse succumbed to her grief and regret, ultimately hanging herself, taking her own life. And to top this off, just as Stannis sees his wife's actions and her body hanging from a tree, he's informed that Melisandre has abandoned him. The action of sacrifice was not rewarded. Stannis has lost half of his army, he has lost his wife, and the one character who gave Stannis his faith in destiny and prophecy has now abandoned him. And while he doesn't say this, it's easy to interpret that Stannis feels his cause was built upon falsehoods from Melisandre, a point he must concede now that she's left him. But what he's truly lost is his daughter, who he sacrificed for the misguided faith he placed into a Red Priest. He lost the one person that the audience could view as a representation of his actual humanity. Stannis is truly a lost character. Now, this is where I have a huge problem with the story development or conclusion of Stannis' character. Its structure in terms of storytelling ultimately allows Stannis' death to fall flat, and here's why. If the message is that prophecy is meaningless, fine, but that's all it says, and it doesn't replace it with anything else at this time for Stannis. So say prophecy is not real, or at least it's misunderstood. That could be one side of this, but then you gotta ask, what is real? What should Stannis have placed his faith and efforts into in opposition to the prophecy? If he's not the prince who was promised, who is he then as a character? His story should be getting very crucial to the themes of the rest of the show now. His character shouldn't just be learning the errors of his beliefs. He shouldn't just get his quick punishment and then be discarded from the story. Stannis has truly been broken. What does it mean? Where is this going? Who is Stannis as a character when all is lost? And he's made a sacrifice that makes his character irredeemable. What role will a character like this play into the bigger picture now? I'm not saying that the audience or even myself should know, but a lot of potential is here. The showrunners for Game of Thrones must have something spectacular to say about this character now. His purpose has been totally transformed. I don't know what they are going to do with him, but I'm very intrigued. What I was not expecting is that Game of Thrones also didn't know of anything more interesting narratively to say about this character, so they just killed off the character. Is that actually the most interesting thing you can do with Stannis after everything we've gone through with this character, especially right after he sacrifices his own daughter? When Stannis inevitably loses the battle against the Boltons, he's killed by Brienne, which seems like it fulfills Brienne's story arc, and yet she's killing a man who is not fighting to live, who it appears has nothing left to add to the story. It doesn't add anything for Brienne's character either, although I believe Brienne's story in Game of Thrones was just too much of a departure from what her character experiences in the 4th book in the source material, A Feast for Crows. This development really doesn't land as you may have thought when Brienne first swore vengeance back in Season 2. For Brienne to just stumble upon Stannis and not encounter any of his remaining army or any of the Boltons, while also actually only being in this area to save Sansa to begin with, it all begins to feel a little contrived for this to all work out. In the books, revenge isn't just some gift that George R.R. Martin grants his characters. Everything has a price or a consequence, but not for Brienne in the show. And I believe if this is the whole purpose of killing Stannis, it falls flat. Again, if we focus on the sacrifice of Shireen, that's a character redefining moment for Stannis, and the conclusion is ultimately that Brienne finally gets her revenge. You can connect the dots, but it's certainly not aligned thematically with anything important to say about these characters. But even if you disagree with this point, you're going to struggle to argue that any real significance is placed on Stannis' death. When you think back to the final episode of Season 5 in Game of Thrones, a lot of major plot events happen. In this episode, Arya is stricken blind. Jaime reveals to Myrcella that he's her father, and she immediately dies in his arms afterwards. You have Cersei's Walk of Atonement, and the episode actually ends with Jon Snow being betrayed and then ultimately killed by the Night's Watch. Even during Stannis' final moments early in the episode, the focus bounces back and forth between Brienne and Sansa finally makes her escape with Theon. As far as excitement, there's so much going on, and for a character like Stannis who was pivotal all the way back into Season 1 before his character even actually made an appearance, to be killed after he's made such a huge sacrifice just feels hollow, and somehow uneventful. The sacrifice of Shireen should have dramatically transformed Stannis as a character, but his death had very little impact other than freeing up Davos and Melisandre to become an unlikely duo supporting Jon Snow's cause and resurrection. Where in the books, you know this is going to be played out much differently, and we don't know if Shireen will actually be sacrificed, but it certainly seems consistent based on the statements made that suggest Shireen's death was author George R.R. Martin's plan, and that's where the showrunners got the idea. Now, after the sacrifice, Stannis certainly appears to have lost everything, and you could argue that the bleak outlook for the character leads to no meaningful future, but I would disagree. I believe you need to answer this question. After all that has happened, and say everything but Stannis' death remains unchanged, is there not very interesting ideas that you're imagining right now with the character still alive after the battle with the Boltons? Or maybe there's no battle with the Boltons at all. But I think about Davos and Melisandre joining Jon Snow at the Wall while Stannis still lives. I think about Stannis stripped of prophecy and duty, disgraced by his choice to sacrifice his daughter, and now without purpose other than revenge of his own against Melisandre perhaps. Maybe this would become too convoluted, and yet that's very similar to the way these things play out in the books. I know many book fans theorize that Stannis may become a White Walker or something more significant in the Dead Army. I don't believe a story of redemption would play well here, but just because Stannis' story has arrived to the darkest and most depressing place imaginable, that does not mean that the story would end there and feel completed. Also missing from what many book fans theorized is that Shireen's death would ultimately be the sacrifice to bring Jon Snow back from the dead, following the notion that only life can pay for death. Now, in the show, you could try and connect those dots, but the show never pulls attention to this, and there's no reason to believe that this is their interpretation or that it was left open to interpretation, as the timeline seems out of order with Shireen dying before Jon. So the real premise of this video essay is to ask this question: what did sacrificing Shireen really even mean narratively or thematically? You could make the argument that it was ultimately the end for Stannis' cause, but before her death that already seemed inevitable. Was Shireen's death really just used to make Stannis' character so irredeemable with such a bleak outlook that instead of exploring a man who sacrificed everything for nothing and what that character becomes, it actually only serves as an excuse to kill off the character Stannis, simply because they had no other ideas of where to take the character? Well, I'm sorry, but I find that incredibly unimaginative and even more disappointing. You guys tell me what you think. And for more Stannis content in the future, as well as even more Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones content, you can click right here.